Welcome back to the home front. I am your host, Reed Galen. Today, I am joined by the one and only Alexis Coe, presidential historian extraordinaire, columnist, I believe, now for the New York Times. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And author of You Never Forget Your First, an absolutely brilliant biography of George Washington, which you absolutely should go out and get, and working on a book about the young John F. Kennedy prior to his presidency. So, Alexis, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Okay, so this is what I've just called What the Fuck Friday. I made that up. It's not particularly novel or original, but here we are.
It
So
works.
it has been one hell of a week. It works, if the shoe fits. And so the reason why I actually asked you to come on this Friday was the beginning of the week that you'd been doing a little bit of writing about the sort of plight of the young American man, and that has been brought home to its worst, I think, possible conclusion here this week in not one, but two places. In Evergreen, Colorado, where a young man was apparently radicalized online, shot two of his classmates and then took his own life. And then here in Utah, where I am, down in Orem, which is about, I don't know, an hour and change southwest of where I am, at Utah Valley University. Charlie Kirk was shot and killed by a sniper's bullet. That young man has subsequently been apprehended. Sounds like by his father, of all people, who was, I think, either current or former law enforcement. But let's start at the beginning. So tell us what you were thinking about when you started writing about what's going on. There's been a lot of talk about the sort of lost generation of young men in America. So tell us where you were coming from when you started writing about it.
I mean, what a week, right? Personally and professionally. I started the week out being frustrated, as I often am, by misattribution. Not the greatest offense of any week, really, but I had been seeing an Alexis de Tocqueville quote all around, saying, as we all do, and it's about, selling Americans what they want to eat. Now, I understand that not everyone read Democracy in America in the fourth grade, and that's for another time. But I do know that it's sort of a lot of the things I see online that are attributed to him are completely wrong. And I started thinking about what he would have really, like, what's real about this, of course, because whenever there's something that's wrong or incorrect or false, there's some sort of meaning behind it, right? Some sort of intention that you try to unpack. And I wondered, what are they trying to say here? And then I realized that actually what Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a great thinker, and he traveled through America, he wrote about the penal system, and he really believed in the American experiment. And what I really started to realize is what he would find most alarming is not necessarily politicians bribing the public, because I think sort of the opposite is happening. They're robbing the public, but he would clearly find that offensive. But I think he would find the isolation that has been perpetuated by by a sort of loss of community to be the most alarming thing. And it is clearly a great threat to our society, because we sort of joke, we dismiss them as incels. We call them other things. But, these, for quite some time we're talking about shootings from the first school shooting. We have known that there are these disaffected young men. And there's this idea that there's the male loneliness epidemic, right? That this is something that is like really affecting the youth, and they've contracted it, and what are we going to do about it? And it occurred to me that is some BS, right? Because they've opted out, and this is actually a civic crisis. And I think that is what you connected with, because that's something that you are very concerned about, that too, on a lot of different levels. And then we just kept racing through the week towards, what do we have here? We have someone like Charlie Kirk, who has made a name for himself. And of course, we want to say from the get-go that political violence is not okay, no matter what. When a society is infected with violence and it's allowed to perpetuate itself, when someone like Trump, goes on television and says, well, the right are just worried and the left are insane. That doesn't help us. But I think that what we know is that Charlie Kirk made a media empire off young men like this. And I think that the through line between them is quite dramatic. And then also, I'm sure you were thinking a lot as I thought this week would be defined by 9/11. So it's kind of all over the place. But I think that's the journey from what I sort of think is like, not a loneliness epidemic, but rather opting out of civics, and that these communities haven't disappeared. They're just deciding not to contribute to them and instead joining sort of the Kirks of the world. And they're not to blame with everything that's going on with society, but here we are.
Well, and I think first of all, to go back to Tocqueville, I'm going to ask you to grade my paper here. Wasn't one of the things he was most amazed about was the Americans' ability to create voluntary associations?
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing. And I think about this as a Californian often too. Like you just declare yourself something and that's it. You're that thing. Whereas on the East Coast and other places, you need generations, you need connections. But to someone who comes from the old world at that time, someone who came from monarchs, from empires that had been really established by the time America was still in its infancy, it seems amazing. America is a wonder. It wasn't a wonder. It doesn't continue to be a wonder because it is sort of inherently blessed in some way. It's because of the active work that de Tocqueville saw Americans doing. And that's community, that's associations, that's declaring what it is we believe in and then establishing it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one of the things you talk about, is this idea of, the loneliness epidemic. I was reading or watching something, and I'm sure you've seen something similar, and this is a little bit off point, but I think it's germane to our conversation that on a dating app, which
Hmm.
I am far too old for any of those sorts of things to have ever been part of my life. That it's like women will swipe whatever the no direction is, right or left, whatever it is, like 80% of the time,
Hmm.
right? Like they're not interested. They're not interested. They're not interested. It's the obverse for young men, which is they say yes 80% of the time, right? And so
Yeah.
you have this delta where it's like, uh, you know, 20% of the guys have access to 80% of the women, and 80% of the women only want something to do with 20% of the guys. And so you have this mismatch. And I'm not talking about dating and interpersonal relationships, but again, if you feel like that you don't have a shot, right, and then you are lonely, and this thing that you and I are both talking on right now fills that void for you, or if and look, I mean, the young male epidemic is not new throughout history. It's certainly not new to
No.
the United States. You could make an argument that throughout our history, whether or not it was the gangs of the Five Points in New York City or the gangs of Los Angeles, right? These were young men without a lot of opportunity, without a lot of community, without a lot of structure in their lives. They go for a place for safety. They go a place for community and camaraderie. And it's sort of like these are the places of last resort. If the family, if the community, if the country, if your state, your whatever it is, isn't going to take care of you, isn't going to look after you, isn't going to provide some level of direction. And I'm saying that we're also in a place where we as parents, as have to do so much more, because there's so many more things out there. I mean, just you think about yesterday, both my kids, 13 and 15, came home and asked if I'd heard about Charlie Kirk. Like they already
Yeah.
knew. Right?
Yeah.
They're in 8th and ninth grade, like, they already knew. There was no hiding it from them. If you
Right.
when you and I are in 8th grade, if that had happened, if we'd been in school, I'm not sure that this would have risen to the ranks of national news. Of course, it was much different time, but certainly it wasn't showing up, like, on the device we were carrying around with us.
No, I was carrying a JanSport. That was my device. But I
Did
think,
you have a Trapper Keeper?
of course, I actually just recently repurchased, I guess, not that I've had one in a while, but a Trapper Keeper. I used it for my first book. I didn't for my second, and then I've sort of like rethought the way I do notes. But it's interesting because, just to back up, you talked about dating apps, you talked about these things. I wasn't on them in my previous life, but I have been. And what I have found most interesting is, yes, I think all the things that I read about them are true. And, I'm on ones that have sort of, they're a little bit different. But I think the thing is, women retreat into their friendships and into their communities. It's not like I just walk outside and I'm like, given friends, I'm just drowning in them. I work hard at that. I work hard at my communities. I seek. It's not always fun. It's not always. It is almost everything is embarrassing. So I think once you accept that, it's fine. But I think everything takes work. And that is something that being mean online or sort of knee-jerk reactions don't. And they don't take regulation. And I think we see a lot of that. And so I don't necessarily, when I look at those, anything about civics, about culture, about the sort of the breakdown of a lot of things, I just don't see it being, well, men are just sort of in this small area, and women are in this small area, just can't find a way to connect. It's that a lot of the men seem reprehensible and like they haven't been outside. And they need to go outside in order to interact with the world. And I think that that is a scary thing only because there is this ire that comes out from these people in when they're behind screens, but also in real life. And then, of course, when you have political violence, when you have, and everything is connected, right? When you have troops in the street, when you have this perpetuation of the idea of discontent and lawlessness, then everything feels unsafe. And then there's confusion about gender roles. I'm not talking about gender, I'm talking about gender roles. But I think in general, people really just want, yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I do think that there is a connection between all these things. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, the response, and I'm so, you're always one of my favorite people to ask about these things. Like, what do you see happening? And the response to me is, I don't want to say lackluster because that's almost too much of a compliment. It's wildly poor. So you have, and it's like with Washington slavery. I'm always confronted with people who, we shouldn't study him. He was an enslaver. That's why you study him. I'm not saying he's your hero. You're not assigned a hero at birth, but good luck studying the United States of America without knowing about George Washington. Also, if you're mad at him and his presence, wouldn't you try to know everything to then discount it? And then the people who think, oh, you're going to cancel him, best of luck. I don't know how you do it. So then what I'm curious about is here, the reaction to it is the same sort of nonsensical. You have people like Ezra Klein, who it's about 50-50 at this point, whether he's going to really make my head explode like the emoji or if I'm going to agree with him. Really don't know what I'm going to get anymore. And he's, sort of,
That's okay because David Brooks is getting old, so somebody has to step into
someone
that
has
job.
to. Although I have to say that Jamel Bowie was with Brooks on PBS the other day, and I was like, oh, I like this. I like Jonathan Capehart, but it was an exciting mashup. And I think because Jamel is always, for me, and I do mean always, that man is always the voice of reason, and he's always grounded in what is both moral and factual and historically relevant. So I think everyone loves him. We can all agree. But I think, well, at least certain types do. But I think what is fascinating to me is then you have people who are acting as if Charlie Kirk, you can say he should not have been murdered. And complexity, I always say with watching with everyone, it's not a liability. He was murdered. He also built an empire off these kinds of confrontations about these issues and was in the business of sustaining ire. It doesn't mean he was always wrong and we couldn't find points of connection. I think he was calling for the release of the Epstein papers, and there were certain things, we all have our moments of agreement. But I'm curious what you think about the reactions to all of this.
Just all right. Let's start with your last point there, which is the inability of so many of us to be able to hold multiple thoughts in our heads simultaneously. No one should be murdered. No one.
Yeah.
Right. Murder is wrong. In fact, I think it might be the first of the 10 commandments: "Thou shalt not kill." Right.
Yeah.
That
100%.
Moses brought down, or Abraham. I get my Old Testament mixed up, but brought down the hill. Right. Like that was the first one. And again, if the double-edged sword of free speech in America is that you can say whatever you want. The downside too is that you can say whatever you want, and sometimes those things upset people. And to your point, like that was very much part of, I think, the magnetism of especially young men who were disaffected and felt left out, felt disrespected, maybe. And I'm not sharing those beliefs so much as trying to explain them, why somebody like a Charlie Kirk would be attractive or magnetizing. And then yes, there are people for whom outrage is currency. And I got a call from a reporter yesterday asking, why did Kirk have such close relationships with the White House? And there's a whole number of them, but you could make an argument that both Trump and Charlie Kirk were brilliant political actors.
Oh,
They were very,
yes.
very good at what he did and what Trump does. They were very good. I told you the one thing that you could see that they both shared was it was almost impossible for Charlie Kirk to lose an argument, even if he went to Oxford and debated a number of very, very young, smart, brilliant British students. And let's say they took him apart on a matter of fact. He was just going to come home and say, well, what would you expect from a bunch of left wing British students, right? Overeducated, snooty students, right? And his people would go, yeah, that's right, Charlie, because they're not interested in the facts. They're interested in the feelings of, as the young folks say, the
Hmm.
vibe. And
Hmm.
that was what he provided was the vibe and the place of, I know that our conservative friends don't like to say safe spaces, but that's what he provided. A place where
Yes.
they felt like they could belong, where they could espouse beliefs that were probably 15 years ago not acceptable in polite society. I'd make an argument most of them aren't now, but now it's almost a trolling thing. Cry harder, cry more, libs. And I think that is one where we see this again. Every so much of what we see though is there's an outrage culture that Charlie Kirk was a part of, but so many of our friends and colleagues are part of it too, which is breaking news. Did you hear what Donald Trump just did? Did you hear what Kash Patel just said? And why do they do that? To inform, maybe. To educate, maybe. To get you to click or subscribe, almost assuredly.
Yeah.
And so it's not a both sidesism sort of as the entire body politic is infected, and the downstream effect of that is political violence, which, as you know, having been being a historian, excuse me, goes back to the founding of the republic. I mean, Alexander Hamilton got shot by Aaron Burr in Weehawken, right? Like
Yes.
that was at the beginning. We have been far from free of political violence since our founding. And it's only, I think, when you see it all matched up just in this year, we've seen the different acts of it, that it starts to sort of pile up in my head. But let me just say one thing, and then I want to get back to hearing your thing. I think part of the other issue is that you hear the left, you hear the right, you hear me, and the average individual who is already sick of so much of this doesn't like seeing anybody get killed. They don't like seeing Charlie Kirk get killed. They don't like seeing two kids get shot at a high school. So they retreat into their caves, right? That mutual
Hmm.
association, right? That volunteer association that we talked about at the top starts to fray because people say, I'm going to keep my head down. I'm going to stay safe. I'm going to, and that level of safety is, I'm going to watch football, or I'm going to look at TikTok for silly videos or whatever it is, but I'm not going to engage in this. And for me, Alexis, the issue then becomes as more and more otherwise normal citizens retreat into those caves looking for safety and silence, even the ground is opened up to even more of these people because now you're leaving a further vacuum.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think, again, the way that we talk about these things is so important. As a historian, if I were, to time travel to the future and I were to write about Charlie Kirk, I wouldn't call him a journalist. I don't even think I would call Barry Weiss at this point a journalist. I would call them media moguls. I would, and if you look at the way that they have promoted their work, that's all you can conclude. Charlie Kirk was really good at not only going to college campuses, meeting people in these venues that seem sort of foreboding to a lot of people, but also he would just show clips of the apex of the fight. And of course, that's always going to be the best moment, but that's a highlights reel. That's not a conversation. Lincoln and Steve Inskeep wrote a great book about this. could be there during those difficult conversations. The goal was not to win. The goal was to try to understand, not to give the other side what they wanted, what they were demanding, because let's remember it was a civil war, but just to try and get what it was they were demanding in this most violent way. And I think the art of a conversation has really been lost, more than even the art of calls, the art of other things. There is this disposability that has permeated our culture that has also, knowledge, relationships, all of that is also up for I don't want to say grabs, but up to be tossed out. And I think that's a really sad point. But I think also, what we're it's important to sort of connect all these things that you're saying, which is political violence here from the beginning. The very act of our revolution, Washington said we'd follow the rules of war, meaning that, we're not just going to rape and pillage. The British did not, and they and the Hessians made quite a name for themselves. But that was, at the same time, let's back up to 1775, as I know everyone wants to do. And let's think about being in Virginia. You have a royal governor, Dunmore, who is saying, okay, the colonists are starting to foment a rebellion. That's clear. It hasn't happened yet. The Declaration of Independence hasn't been issued. And of course, we're approaching our 250. So I'm always thinking about this. But what we do have here is a bunch of people saying that they don't have rights and they're enslavers. And Dunmore and a lot of the British leaders in America were enslaved people too. But the trade had been outlawed by that time in London. There were all sorts of complications. The world was shifting in this way. And so Dunmore says, listen, enslaved people, go ahead and rebel against your leaders and then come to our side and we will give you freedom. He didn't offer that to his enslaved people, just other people's enslaved people. And that happened. People escaped and they went and they fought against their masters. That is political violence. You cannot say that's not political violence.
Right. Well, or the Bostonians, pillaging the royal governor's house there.
Absolutely.
And prior to the revolution, or obviously John Brown,
Oh, yes.
was part of a lot of political violence long before he got to Harper's Ferry.
So John Brown, for those who are watching, he inspired Booth to assassinate Lincoln by taking over an artillery and armory and staging a rebellion for, he was against slavery. And so his influence is debated, really good books about that too. And it's an inspiring story, but violence begets violence. That is absolutely true, no matter which side you're on. We also have to look at the thing that connects all of these things, which are guns, and the idea of a standing army, which I don't think Washington would agree with.
And the colonials were not a fan of.
No, but and every town does great work on this. A lot of places do good work on this. There was a short-lived gun violence control and prevention office that Biden had established that never got any attention. But I think what's really interesting is the arguments that always win in court, the reasons guns you see wins here and there, and you see lots of loses. But the reason we have gun violence in schools, once we accepted that it's okay if children get killed, once we accept that it's okay that political leaders get killed, all these things, so that people can have guns in cases they don't lock up, is that we are the court cases that are winning are based on colonial era court cases. They're not based even on American court cases. So what we're doing is we're judging American law. We're saying what it should and should be based on a time when we were under the thumb of a monarchy. And so really, there's a lot of things that don't make sense here that perpetuate violence. And it comes, we're getting really far from who we were supposed to be, which was never a perfect nation full of perfect people, but it was one that was supposed to always be becoming. And we have not. And so I think that's what's scariest to me about everything this week. And again, we barely talked about 9/11. No one has.
Right. Well, and I think we should write a book called Unbecoming. But we'll get to that later. But I want to stay on the gun piece of this for a second, because the young man who has been arrested, who was allegedly the shooter of Charlie Kirk, this was a young man from Washington, Utah, southern Utah, near St. George, down near Zion National Park, for those of you who've been down there. Grew up in a LDS family, not surprisingly, very heavily LDS state, but in particular there. And you see the early footage. This was a young man who grew up with firearms. This was a young man who was clearly proficient with them. And and that's part of the culture here. In fact, the legislature here in Utah just passed a bill, I think earlier this year in the legislative session, that allowed for open carry on college campuses at the request of some of the colleges. And so, here you literally don't even need a license anymore. Once you a firearms license, when you turn 18, you could go to name your sporting goods store, buy a 9mm, buy 15 shells, and strap it to your hip and walk around. Now, not most people, the vast majority of people don't do that, but that's the permissive culture, or even the encouraged culture, I'd say, Alexis, when it comes to firearms, which to me is also this it's beyond romanticizing a firearm, right? It's fetishizing a firearm. And then people are shocked when horrific videos like I accidentally saw yesterday make their way through the pipes, as our ancient members of Congress would call them, and see for real what these things do to people. And I think that was the other part. It wasn't just in the abstract. Charlie Kirk shot at UVU. It was Charlie Kirk shot, and the video made its way around, and everybody saw it. And so
Yes.
you couldn't just make it an abstraction anymore. It wasn't just an act of political violence or an act of violence. It was an act of bodily destruction that everybody saw, or so many people saw. And I think that was, maybe I'm overstating it, but that seemed to
No, I
be
don't think you're overstating it. I mean, we know this from Vietnam. We know that the second you show violence, it becomes real, and it arguably ended the Vietnam War. And that was televised. That was unprecedented. We have never seen the bodies of children on any of these program, any sort of moment in which that news is announced. In Uvalde, they had to be identified. Not They weren't identifiable by their faces,
right.
by their features. And so I think that that is important. What we will see is made of it, aside from shock. Is there a fetishization that's happening? What does it tell us about violence and its future? I think that's actually essential. I don't see that being a problem. I think every single time there's school shooting, what I do find a problem is that this week, at the end of this week, that's all I'm hearing about. I'm not hearing about Democratic leaders who have been shot down and murdered for the same reasons this year, in this calendar year. We're not hearing much about what happened in Colorado. We're not hearing about these things. And so what you have is this danger also of prioritizing one person who put himself at the center of it. And then you also are ignoring that this is an anomaly, not as a victim of gun violence, but this is an anomaly in that we are seeing that. Like, there should be a demand for all the rest. It's sort of like Trump releasing certain documents and not releasing others. You either do it or you don't. And so I think more information and more visuals would be better for all Americans, because not only do we live in this incredibly polarized state where people get angry and they murder other people, and that always existed, but constantly now at a much higher rate than ever before. It's not like, oh, it's anecdotal. It's at a much higher rate. Then you also have this conflation with what is how we remember people and how we talk about them. When we talk about John Brown, it's still complicated. But I'm seeing Charlie Kirk is a martyr. That is not how historians will remember him.
Can I steal a few extra minutes from you?
Please, yes.
So I was thinking about something as you said that, and thinking about the entertainment culture in this
Hmm.
country. That if you go to Netflix or Prime Video, there are endless true crime shows, right? Docudramas or whatever. Endless police, cops and robbers programs. Endless shows about some surly English detective tracking down a cold case in some faraway island.
Yes,
Um,
I watched that
and
one.
Yeah, we've all watched that one. They made it 80 times, so it was hard to
Yeah.
miss. But are we inuring ourselves to this too? Because we tend to gravitate
Mhm.
towards, towards people getting killed, towards murder. That it's and then to your point, Reed Epstein in his write up in the New York Times said something about this shocked this. It was I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't remember the exact words, but something like Kirk's murder shocked the system like school shootings used to,
Yeah.
right? And I just wonder if every one of us has built this, and maybe out of necessity, this emotional callus to say, if I really opened up my emotions to what was going on here, I'm not sure I could get through the day.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm not sure I could function. I don't think you would send your kids to school. It's incredibly difficult. It's interesting though because I think there's a lot of what do we do? What do we do? What do we do about the male epidemic crisis? What do we do about gun violence? What do we do about polarization? Engage. Like the answer, no matter where you are here, no matter the subject, no matter where you are in the political spectrum, no matter where you are geographically speaking in America, the answer is not civics lessons, it's civics engagement. And that is so easy. Pick one little thing, ride it. You could be Speaker of the House. That's how we got him. Like, you just need to get engaged on the most local level. Child in the Village is talking about in my village is talking about, the sidewalks and how they need to be taken care of. They're a risk to us all. Found the only bipartisan issue. Like,
Right.
really, it can happen. And so I think local engagement is essential for everyone here. Because this is acceptable worldwide does not mean it has to be acceptable here. Trump is very much confusing the narrative and the difference between our understanding and our conception. And I maintain that he can say whatever he wants doesn't make it true. There's still a difference between states' rights and federal government. There's federal overreach. We use that phrase for a reason. There's still a lot of control that people can have on the ground level in their villages, in their cities, in their towns. But they have to do it, and you can't just say, "I don't know what to do. I'm apathetic." But I do think engaging is true. But what's interesting is, we talk about these sort of true crimes and stories and also these manufactured ones. I am got a preview clip to the new Garfield series, and I have on Netflix. It's coming out. James A. Garfield.
Oh, not Garfield, the lasagna loving cat, and his best bud Odie.
No, but that would also be thrilling. That would
Well,
also
then,
be thrilling.
put it at the bottom of the list for me.
I know. But no, to Garfield, but it opens literally with a scene with like brains. And it occurred to me, oh, people really don't know who James Garfield is. And this is great news. Of course, as a historian, I love this. I think, how else do you get people interested in civil service reform? Like, for me, this is a win is a win. I don't love the way, I want everyone to talk about Chester A. Arthur, not all the time, but like far more than they do. And at the same time, I had this idea, I showed this to you before, you've seen this. I have this, I'm studying, I'm reading a book on Kennedy. I know all about all the presidential assassinations, but a lot of people don't know this about Garfield. And my one concern I did have this week all of a sudden was, is this normalizing this kind of violence? Will people think, oh, well, a bunch of presidents have been assassinated or attempted assassinations? Attempted assassinations, absolutely. We don't even know half of it. But because why would we if they failed? But we also I'm a little bit afraid that it will normalize it to a greater degree. However, I want to point something out here: how far the Republican Party has come. Your farmer party. I know this is where to begin, but if we could go back to Reagan, there was an attempted assassination, and what did he do after that? He wrote an op-ed. We have the Brady Bill. He wasn't like a, hippie or a no guns ever. No sense of the word. It's not like he was suddenly saying guns everywhere are terrible, but you have the face, the heart of the Republican Party for a long time until Trump, who came out and really was changed by an experience and wrote about it, not perfectly again, but you did see some evolution as a presidential historian, because they always say, oh, he had an evolution. They never do. that to me is really compelling. And we're not going to see that here. You certainly didn't see that with Trump when there was an attempted assassination on his, it grazed his ear.
Right. Well, and
Yeah.
remember that President George H.W. Bush 41 famously renounced his NRA membership after they had, I don't remember what the event was, but they'd said something horrible. And he said, I've been a lifelong member, yada, yada, yada. You can count me out.
I don't think
But
he famously the thing with HW that I appreciate as I get older and older, and I think I've appreciated for a long time, what a human being. Like, he was a
right.
real human being. And I don't think people really understand that. There are very few times in which I always pause when I see an HW letter. I see something, a primary source. James Wilson at the State Department is always posting the best things about what he finds in the archives about, and it's usually about it's about a bunch of people, but he's been in Stowcraft and all these things, and it's been a lot of HW. And yes, so I think principled stances, not just for clicks or to sell hats or shoes or whatever it is, or tickets, subscriptions, absolutely, absolutely. I would love to see it.
Well, as would I. And I would as much as I appreciate the more than 300 people who've joined us here today, and thank you for that, guys. I'm glad we have these phones so that you can do this or on your laptop, wherever it is you're watching it. But to Alexis's point, um, you know, go out and do something for your community or in your community. Alexis, I'll leave us with this. I interviewed Amanda Littman yesterday. She co-founded a group called Run for Something that
Right.
recruits Americans under the age of 40, typically Democrats, to run for state and local office. And I asked her how she sort of gets through all of this stuff. And she said this brilliant thing that I'm going to repeat over and over again. Only consume the poison you have the antidote for. And what
Mm,
she said by that is, if you think that consuming that content or that information is something that you can actually take action to correct, then it's okay. If you're just doing it because you're a sponge for bad news and everything else, like, don't do that to yourself. And
yeah.
I think it's brilliant. I think it's one of the most brilliant things I've heard in a long time. But as I have said to everybody, I'll say to you again here as we get ready to go into a weekend, is like, guys, it's not your job to stand in front of the fire hose, right?
No.
There's a lot of bad stuff, but I'll tell you this: there are people that care about you and you care about. There are things that need you and that you need, right? Focus on those things, right? As Alexis is probably the best person to tell us this, it took us a very, very long time to get here. And it's going to take us a pretty long time to get out. But the other most important thing, Alexis, that you said, which is it also takes work, right? This
Yes.
stuff is hard. Like, we didn't get here, just overnight. We didn't get here because one person made the wrong move here or there. And it's not going to happen that way either. In these moments, now it's the time to say, okay, what is it I can do in my place, in my neighborhood, in my community? Because those are the places that most affect our lives, most affect our children's lives, most affect the sidewalks in Alexis's hometown, most help me and my friends battle rapacious developers with support from across the political spectrum here in Utah. So, guys, you can do your part. But remember, last thing I promise in my sermon is there are no silver bullets. So don't go looking for them. It's okay to say, I'm going to do one little thing. I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. No one is asking you, and
Yes.
no one would expect you to have all the answers to everything. I certainly don't have them. As my 15-year-old was very disappointed to hear earlier this week. So I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Alexis, please.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And remember that just a little something is better than nothing. A little something, it weighs so much more than nothing.
All right, before I let you get to your afternoon, Alexis, where can we find your work? Where can we find your books? And what else do we need to know about you before we let you go?
I'm on Substack. Alexis Coe Study Mary Kill is a Substack. I have Instagram, and I'm not on Twitter really or Blue Sky that much. Those are kind of the places to find me. alexiscoe.com. I wrote a column for the Times, but You Never Forget Your First is in most bookstores and libraries, and I'm really grateful that it's still so relevant. and follow me on those places, and you'll be able to catch up. Usually Substack is the best for the latest, and I write a lot of reactions to what's happening in real time, and I love to answer questions. I have a new series called Reply Some, and in which I like selectively pick out those, and some of them are so good, and they give me such great ideas. But I'm also doing a lot of series on lesser known presidents because I think that's really important too. In some ways, Trump has taught us anyone can be president, and I think it's a good reminder that some of these guys would never be president today. Um, but I am hopeful that there any sort of moment in which we are all looking at the same thing and at least deciding it's not okay. I will leave everyone with this. That is a moment in which we have very often found our way back. I'm not going to say our footing, but we can crawl towards something better than what we are seeing now. And so I think any sort of effort, civic engagement, not civics lessons, civic engagement. Let's make it a verb.
Amen to that. All right. As always, gang, you can find me here on the home front. I hope you'll subscribe if you haven't already. Please also subscribe to Alexis. You can find me on the podcast over at the home front and on all the socials. Look for Reed Galen. I'm sure you'll find me. Alexis Coe, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Everybody else, have a healthy, safe weekend, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.